No matter how good NBA teams are at making trades and moves with players, not a single team throughout NBA history has escaped making a bad one, which is why we're looking to see exactly what is the worst trade that every NBA team has ever made. And let's start first with the Atlanta Hawks. Now obviously their worst trade that they've moved on from now, but anytime looking back in history, it'll still haunt them that they traded Bill Russell. The Hawks had the second overall pick in that year's draft, and the Celtics weren't picking until later on. So they convinced Atlanta to accept a trade of six-time All-Star Ed McCauley and Cliff HAGAN for the freshly drafted Bill Russell, who Atlanta didn't see his true potential. Cliff and Ed would become NBA All-Stars, while Bill would become a top 10 player of all time, so this one definitely hurt. Oh, and the team that picked first overall that year that also passed on Bill originally, of course, was the Sacramento Kings. But speaking of the Celtics, when they come to mind, you usually don't imagine them ever making a bad trade. Well, at first thought the KYRIE Irving for Isaiah Thomas trade might actually come to mind, but honestly at the time, that was a good move. KYRIE was a superstar and they knew that IT was injured. So instead, let's go back to 1998 when Chauncey BILLUPS was drafted 3rd overall by Boston, then traded after 51 games for Kenny Anderson, Popeye Jones, and Zan Tabak, aka nobody. Sure, Chauncey was underwhelming at first and it took him 6 or 7 years to come into his own, but waiting that long still would have been better than having nothing. Obviously for the Nets, their worst was and will always be that KG and Paul Pierce trade. The Hornets will never top theirs either of drafting Kobe Bryant 13th overall, then trading him to the Lakers for Vlade Divac, who went on to do nothing for the franchise and left after 2 years, while Kobe Bryant of course became an all-time great. The Chicago Bulls found themselves in a similar scenario in 2006 when they drafted LaMarcus Aldridge 2nd overall, then immediately traded him for Tyrese Thomas. As we know, Aldridge would go on to become a 7-time All-Star and the best power forward in the league for a couple years there, while Tyrese Thomas, well, he averaged 7 points and 4 rebounds a game for his career. For the Cleveland Cavaliers, their worst trade was that previously mentioned KYRIE Irving trade. They traded one of the best players in the NBA and in return got a couple of role players, a pick, and got a star who only played 15 games for them. Again, not the Cavs' fault, they didn't know IT was injured at the time, and I've always been kinda surprised though that there were never any real repercussions on the Celtics for doing this, because I mean it's clear they knew what they were up to. The Mavericks had no idea what they were doing though when they traded away Jason Kidd. They originally drafted him and it was clear that he was great from the start, but when him and head coach Jim Clemens clashed about how to run the team, they traded Kidd for Michael Finley, Sam Cassell, and AC Green. Sure, Finley and Cassell had good careers, but Kidd became an all-time great and they traded him only in year 3. And what makes it even worse is that they then fired Clemens at the end of that season because they realized he was a bad coach. For the Denver Nuggets, back in 1980, they traded a first-round pick for a player named T.R. Dunn, who clearly wasn't all that good. Well, 3 years later, that first-round pick turned into Clyde Drexler. The Detroit Pistons won the NBA championship in 2004. Well, by 2008, they had already traded some of their main pieces from that squad, but they were still making the Eastern Conference Finals almost every year. So I guess to try and take that next step, they traded a prime Chauncey Billups and Antonio McDyess for Allen Iverson, which didn't make any sense at all, especially seeing that AI would play 54 games in Detroit. They would ask him to come off the bench. He refused and left the team in that offseason, pretty much losing Chauncey for nothing. The Warriors found themselves in a similar situation where they lost a star for nobody, when low ticket sales and a feud with his head coach caused the Warriors to trade Wilt Chamberlain to Philly for 3 guys I've never heard of, and I don't know what's worse, that or trading Chris Webber after his first season in the NBA for Tom Hughes, and 3 picks that turned into Anton Jameson, Larry Hughes, and Todd Fuller. Back in 1996, the Rockets traded for Charles Barkley. You see, they had just won their 2 championships with Hakeem. Then in 1995, they tried to three-peat but weren't able to, so they wanted to bring in some extra help to pair with Olajuwon and Drexler. So they traded 4 players, including a young Robert Horry and Sam Cassell, to the Phoenix Suns in exchange for a 33-year-old Barkley who wasn't the same player they were expecting. He never helped them to a championship and eventually just fell off before retiring. The Indiana Pacers may never have made a trade worse than this one, and for their sake, let's hope that they never do, because in it they traded Kawhi Leonard for George Hill in the 2011 draft. They saw a lot of potential in George at the time, and I don't know why, because obviously they had everything backwards. The same goes for the Clippers, who couldn't possibly have made a worse mistake, and it shows why they were so bad for so long, because also in 2011 they traded Baron Davis and a first rounder to the Cavs for Mo Williams to clear cap space. Well, then that first rounder turned out to be the first overall pick, aka KYRIE Irving, which means they wouldn't have needed to trade for Chris Paul and could have had a young core of Kyrie, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan, Eric Bledsoe, Eric Gordon, and Al-Farouq Aminu. Staying in LA, the Lakers have had some pretty bad deals made in their history as well. The Russell Westbrook trade was bad, the one for Steve Nash, and the Dwight Howard deal, but none were worse than what they got in return for Shaq, one of the best players in the league at the time in his prime, and all they got was Brian Grant, Lamar Odom, and Caron Butler. Not a bad set of players, but you'd think maybe they should have gotten a little bit more for Shaq. The worst trade the Grizzlies ever made without a doubt was when they traded a young all-star Pau Gasol for Kwame Brown, JAVARIS, CRITTENTON, 2 first-round picks, and LA's freshly drafted Marc GASOL, who nobody really knew at the time. And it makes you wonder what they were thinking. I mean, the picks were good, but this still seemed like a terrible deal. And I think Memphis just really got lucky with Marc Gasol surprising everyone, being as good as he was. In the 90s, the Miami Heat drafted Steve Smith, and he was developing into a great player and an even better shooter. But trying to become a championship team, the Heat traded a young Steve to the Hawks for a veteran Kevin Willis. And when they finally started to get into those deep playoff runs, the one thing that they lacked was a good outside shooter. We all know that the Milwaukee Bucks had Kareem for his early years, then eventually he went and played for the Lakers. But you might not have realized it was due to their all-time worst trade, because they traded Kareem to the Lakers, who went on to win 5 NBA championships, and in return got Elmore Smith, Brian Winters, David Myers, and Junior Bridgman, who all only had 2 All-Star appearances between the 4 of them. For the Timberwolves, when Kevin Garnett finally decided to move on from the team, he was traded to the Boston Celtics for Ryan Gomes, Gerald Green, THEO, RATLIFF, Sebastian Telfair, 2 first-round picks, and Al Jefferson, who Minnesota thought was going to be their next star. And while he'd go on to put up similar numbers to KG, he was never the same player and never even made the All-Star team, while none of those other guys were anything more than role players. And the first-round picks turned into nothing too, so it ended up being a really bad deal for Minnesota. The Pelicans have a long history of not making the best move, but one of their worst would have to be just basically trading a rookie Buddy Hield for DeMarcus Cousins. Some of the pieces were involved, but they didn't really mean much to either team. And they had just drafted Hield 6th overall that year and jumped at the opportunity to trade him for DeMarcus when they could. Of course, though, this still wouldn't be as bad on paper if it wasn't for Cousins' injury. For the Knicks, their worst trade that comes to mind was trading for Andrea Bargnani. They gave up Marcus Camby, Steve Novak, Quentin Richardson, 2 second-round picks, and a first for the former 1st overall pick. He would then only play 117 games in 3 seasons, mostly off the bench for them, before finding his way completely out of the NBA. The Philadelphia 76ers have had some pretty bad trades in the past, but the worst may very well be when they were involved in the 4-way trade for Andrew Bynum. They basically gave up prime Andre Iguodala, young Nikola Vucevic, Maurice Harkless, and 2 first-round picks, and didn't get a single meaningful game out of the man. And it was really this trade that sent them into the whole process thing that caused them to be one of the worst NBA teams of all time. Now, a lot of trades in this video were bad in hindsight, but the Raptors made a deal for Vince Carter that even at the time nobody could believe actually happened. In his prime, they traded the most important player in the history of their franchise for Alonzo Mourning, who never played a game there, Eric Williams, Aaron Williams, and 2 first-round picks, which equated to basically nothing and was one of the reasons Raptors fans have always had such a mixed relationship with Vince. Now, for the Wizards, I know we're supposed to just do one, but I got a small list here. They traded a 25-year-old Chris Webber for a 33-year-old Mitch Richmond, a 21-year-old Rasheed Wallace for a 30-year-old Rod Strickland. They traded a 24-year-old Ben Wallace for a 30-year-old Ike Austin, a 24-year-old Rip Hamilton for Jerry Stackhouse, and a 23-year-old Kelly Oubre for Trevor Ariza, who was 33. So talk about an impatient team. They would have had so much talent had they just waited, which was probably why they were so scared to trade Bradley Beal, because they knew they would just mess that up too. For the Orlando Magic, their worst trade will always and forever be trading a young Victor Oladipo and a freshly drafted Domantas Sabonis for Serge Ibaka, and nothing else needs to be said. The Phoenix Suns traded Isaiah Thomas the year before he broke out for a first-round pick and Marcus Thornton, which when you go back and look at what Isaiah did soon after, makes this trade look disgusting, especially with the fact that the Suns eventually ended up desperately needing a starting point guard soon after. The San Antonio Spurs are one of the better teams when it comes to doing deals around the league, but when Kawhi Leonard demanded a trade, they really had no choice but to trade him for DeMar DeRozan, and that easily goes down as their all-time worst. The Utah Jazz actually drafted Dominique Wilkins 3rd overall and held on to him for 3 whole months. Watched him practice, saw him work out, met up with multiple teams, and then decided to trade him to the Hawks for Freeman Williams and John Drew. The Sacramento Kings have a whole collection of terrible trades. Now, we just mentioned that Isaiah Thomas eventually became an MVP candidate and a superstar. Well, before that, and before the Suns had him, the Kings originally had their hands on him. They were the ones that drafted him. And when it came time to sign him to a $28 million contract, they instead traded him to Phoenix for a $7 million trade exception. So not even for a player, basically just for cash. The Portland Trailblazers have never been able to win a championship as a franchise, and trades like this one probably don't help. When they traded a 21-year-old Jermaine O'Neal to the Pacers for a 30-year-old Dale Davis, who at the time had just averaged a career-high 10 points and 9 rebounds a game. They didn't even give Jermaine a chance as a starter, but then the Pacers did, and almost right away he became an all-star. So I don't feel bad at all for Portland on this one. Then of course the Oklahoma City Thunder can blame their worst trade on the deal that they gave to the Rockets to send them James Harden. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.